Welcome everyone to this year's Housing Agency Research Summer Series of talks. This summer, we are showcasing housing agency research and the housing agency funded research through the Housing Agency's Research Support Programme. The Housing Agency has a team of researchers working on research projects, inputting and informing policy. They also collaborate with other organisations on research and procure research from external researchers and organisations on behalf of the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage and others. In 2020, the Housing Agency launched the Research Support Programme, and Shane Burke, our Head of Research, is going to talk about that in a moment. Under the resources section of the Housing Agency website, you'll find links to Housing Agency research and policy publications, papers and reports, and there's also a section for the Research Support Programme. So this is the first session of the Research Summer Series, and the topic today is renting in Ireland with a focus on the private rented sector. This is a sector which is undergoing a huge amount of change since the global financial crisis. Between Census 2011 and the last census in 2016, the share of households living in the private rented sector doubled, with a fifth of all households, almost a fifth of all households as of the last census living in the private rented sector now. So our first speaker, who is Dr. Richard Waldron, is going to discuss his research on the private rented sector. He looked at the conditions which have driven this shift into the private rented sector, and he's also explored the extent and experience of housing precarity among renters in the sector in Ireland. Our second speaker today is Anne Murphy, who is from the Housing Agency. She has taken a dive into the Housing Agency's own ongoing research study on Irish housing attitudes and experiences. And she's going to use the 2020 dataset to look at some of the differences in attitudes and experiences seen between homeowners and renters. So we'll hear first from both speakers, and then at the end, we're going to have time for questions. So you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to feed questions through for Richard and Anne. But before we start, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Shane Burke, our Head of Research, who'd like to say a couple of words to you about the Research Support Programme.
Thanks very much, Rosalind. So the Research Support Programme funds topical research in the area of housing, which has the potential to impact policy and practice. And to date, we've funded 11 research support programmes. We'll be launching our call out for the next RSP at the end of the month. We'll also be having an information session on the 20th of July, and there'll be a link to the mailing list to that information session in the chat box for this particular webinar. So thanks very much for that, and I'll hand you back over to Rosalind.
Thanks, Shane. So just to introduce Richard Waldron is a lecturer in the School of Natural and Built Environment at Queen's University, Belfast. His research relates to the intersection of urban planning policy, housing markets, and strategies for urban economic development. His work has been published in leading journals, including Housing Studies, the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research and Environment and Planning. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Richard. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rosalind, and thanks very much for having me today. I'm just going to upload my slides here, and hopefully everybody can see that. So yes, thank you. My name is Richard Waldron. Obviously, I'm a lecturer in planning in Queen's University, Belfast, and so my paper is titled Generation Rent and Housing Precarity in Post-Crisis Ireland. And so this comes out of, as Rosalind has said, a larger project around the private rental sector that was funded by the Housing Agency over the last year to 18 months or so. And that project really sought to look at the extent and the experience of housing precarity among renters over the course of Ireland's economic recession and recovery period broadly, that period from 2008 to 2016. And there were a couple of objectives. I sought to look at the shift, the extent of that shift towards the private rental sector and the conditions shaping that growth. But I also sought to develop a Housing Precarity Index, which I'll talk about today, and using indicators from the European Union's survey on incomes and living conditions. And I applied that to data on renters to examine the statistical relationships between precarity and a whole range of individual characteristics and trying to determine what the predictors of precarity are. Now, I'm going to talk about those three objectives in this presentation today, but I've also done follow-up qualitative work looking at young renters' lived experiences of housing precarity as they navigate the rental sector, and how those renters plan the coping strategies they develop to plan for their family's well-being in challenging housing circumstances. And I'll put up links to some of those papers at the end. So we know that, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, there has been a significant growth in the private rental sector in a number of countries. It's not just in Ireland, it's in the UK, Australia, America, Spain. And this is really coming out of the conditions after the crash. Firstly, the huge rebound in property values, which has priced many, particularly younger people, out of the home ownership sector. But it's also as a result of tightening mortgage lending restrictions or conditions around lending, obviously coming out of that crash. But we've also seen huge demand from investors for property assets, for those to be re-let within the private rental sector as well. And this has fueled this demographic growth among what has been termed generation rent. The term was actually coined by the Halifax Building Society back in 2011 in a report into UK home ownership, where they found that 25 to 34-year-olds, the home ownership rate had actually declined from about 67% to just 43% over the course of 2 decades up to 2011. And of course, these shifts are related to a whole range of broader economic inequalities around changing labor markets, income inequality, changes around welfare, the rise of the gig economy and the sharing economy, and these sorts of issues. And there's been a huge literature has emerged on the kind of political economic conditions shaping the growth of the rental sector. But there had been less work done on the nature and the experiences of the challenges of the precarities that were being experienced by young renters. And this was the gap that I was trying to address. So I look at this issue of the rental sector and generation rent through a framework of precarity. So what is precarity? Well, the concept of precarity really originates within the field of labor studies to describe the risks arising from the spread of greater labor market flexibility, employment insecurity, low incomes, and weakening social welfare provision. So precariousness really describes a state of uncertainty where an individual's exposure is increased as a result of their, individual characteristics, vulnerable characteristics. So really, the concept of precarity tries to capture the distribution of risk within society and explores how an individual's exposure to adverse events might be amplified by their economic and social circumstances. Now, helpfully, this term or this concept is increasingly being applied within housing research, and Amy Clare and colleagues helpfully provide a definition for housing precarity, which is a state of uncertainty which increases a person's real or perceived likelihood of experiencing an adverse event caused in part by their relationship with their housing provider, the physical qualities, the affordability and security of their home, and access to essential services. So there are 4 key components of precarity: an affordability element that may push an individual below a poverty threshold, issues of insecurity of tenure, issues of poor quality housing and the impact that might have on well-being and mental health, but also the challenge of actually accessing affordable and secure housing as well. So in terms of methodology, I look at a number of different sources. I firstly map out the growth of the rental sector using census cross-tabulated data between 2006 and 2016. And then I devised this Housing Precarity Index from the EU Survey on Incomes and Living Conditions. And I apply that to nationally representative samples of renting households in 2008, 2012, and 2016. So capturing the beginning of the crash, the kind of nadir of that crash in 2012, and then this kind of recovery period in 2016. And I apply this index really to try and work out the differences between different renting subgroups and to understand the predictors of precarity among those subgroups as well. And I use a series of descriptive and inferential statistics to do that, chi-square tests and linear regression. So this table gives you an indication of the components of the precarity index I've developed and the indicators, and I provide the snapshots in terms of responses for each of those years to each of these questions in 2008, 12, and 16. So the affordability dimension is assessed by a question on the individual's perception of their housing costs. And if it's a heavy burden, they're considered to demonstrate that element of precarity. Security is assessed by two questions. One, whether the household has been in arrears in the previous 12 months, so potentially at risk of losing their home. But I also take a wider view of security to look at the security of their wider living environment and whether there's the presence of crime, violence, or vandalism in their area. The quality dimension is assessed by two indicators: whether there is the presence of leaks or damp in the home, whether the home is sufficiently lit, whether there are pollution or environmental problems in their immediate living area, and whether the home has central heating. I adapt Clare et al.'s Precarity Index slightly to make it a bit more user-friendly over a series of years, and I include a dimension on financial capacity. So whether the household is finding it difficult or very difficult to make ends meet, giving some kind of indication into their ability to manage their household budget, but also their ability or inability as it is to afford unexpected expenses. So are they capable of dealing with unanticipated financial shocks? And I merged these six indicators together to create a scaled index ranging from 0 to 1, with 0 being no precarity whatsoever, and 1 demonstrating maximum precarity where they're affected by all 6 of these indicators. And I'll come back to that in just a second. But to look then at the growth of the rental sector in Ireland, we know that Ireland has traditionally been a high home ownership society. In the early 90s, about 80% of households owned their home. And that remained at very, very high levels up until about the early 2000s, when, as the Celtic Tiger boom took hold, affordability issues started to become more of an issue in the home ownership sector, and we start to see the first decline in ownership rates in about 2002. And that decline becomes intensified over the course of the financial crash, dropping down to about 68% of all homeowners, or 68% of all households owning their home in 2016. But actually that rate has fallen even further within Dublin, where the ownership rate now stands at 60%. But among the among the under 35-year-old age group, that ownership rate has now dropped to just 22%. At the same time, nationally, renters now make up 18% of all households, but among the under 35 group in Dublin, 60% are now renting their homes. And so again, this comes out of the conditions of the crash. Obviously, there's a rebound of property values. There's increasing restrictions around mortgage lending through the macroprudential rules. It also comes out of, as I said, investors coming into the Irish market, capitalizing on that, devalue in property after the crash. But it also comes about by issues in housing policy as well, and austerity. The limited capital expenditure on social housing provision, at least in the early years of the crash and in the aftermath of that crash, we saw capital investment on social housing decline to about 167 million in 2014. Now that has increased obviously in years since, but we've also seen a shift towards accommodating social housing need within the private rental sector through rent subsidization, through schemes like HAP. So households are being deflected into the rental sector, more middle-class households that perhaps would have had that normative expectation to access home ownership, are being deflected into the rental sector because of high housing costs and lending conditions, but also from those that traditionally may have been housed in the social rental sector are now being accommodated in private rental through rent subsidization. And what we're seeing is a major change in the demographic profile of renters. So if the rental sector in Ireland traditionally, housed, students, migrants, young professionals, perhaps working in their first jobs just out of university or college, and maybe lower income households as well, that demographic is changing quite considerably. No longer is the under 30 age group the largest cohort of renters in Ireland today. It's actually those aged in the key family formation age group, aged between 30 and 44 years, who have seen their numbers increase in the rental sector by 191% over that 10-year period. We're also seeing increasing families within the rental sector. We're seeing married couples, increasing by 179% over that 10-year period. Again, I think the normative expectation in Ireland traditionally was you were married in your late 20s, early 30s, you took out a 30, 35-year mortgage, you bought your home and began to raise your family. But now we're seeing huge growth in families entering the rental sector. Couples with children increasing by 272%, and lone parents with children increasing by 137% over that 10-year period. But again, we're also seeing more middle income groups entering the rental sector in greater numbers. Those in terms of socioeconomic grouping, those in the lower professions and higher professions, increasing by 145 and 130%, relative to those in the manual and semi-skilled socioeconomic groupings who are increasing by just 88%. So the profile is very much changing sharply. Spatially, I think there's also an interesting pattern occurring. Whereas if in Dublin, the traditional renting core of the city was within the canals. But over this 10-year period, we're seeing a huge increase in renters moving out to the suburbs, the periphery, and the wider hinterland of Dublin, and particularly the commuter towns, major commuter towns like Navan and Naas. And this trend is actually accentuated when you just look at the data for renting families. So I think what's happening is that high rental costs are deflecting renters out into the suburbs and hinterland as they're looking to access cheaper rental accommodation. But I think they're also looking for larger family-sized units as well. And I think there's a particular challenge around the supply of family-sized rental units within the city cores. And these are patterns that we're also seeing in Cork and Galway and Limerick. So there is a spatial dimension to this. Obviously, these kind of supply and demand issues are obviously sparking a huge increase in rental values. And I appreciate this data is only up to 2017. A lot of the early analysis for this work was done in late 2019, early 2020. But even over that 5-year period, in terms of new rents, we're seeing an increase of 43% in rents for 1-bed units in Dublin, 38% for 2 beds, and 31% for 3 beds. So there is, considerable affordability challenges. So when returning to the Housing Precarity Index, as I said, I took this basket of measures and I scaled it from 0 to 1. And then I broke out those groups, but depending on whether they experienced, no precarity, low levels of precarity, medium precarity, or high precarity. And what you're seeing is, between 23 and 28%, depending on the year, of renters are they're 0 on that scale, no issues. Between 41 and 42% are experiencing low precarity, so between 0 and 0.3 on the scale. Between 20 and 23% are experiencing mid-levels of precarity, between 0.3 and 0.6 on the scale. And then somewhere between 7 and 14%, depending on the year, are experiencing high levels of precarity. Now, if I take that proportion for 2016 and apply it to the rental data from the census in that year, what that's telling you is about 235,000 renting households in Ireland are experiencing some degree of housing precarity. But about 25% or 25,000 renting households are experiencing high levels of precarity. And if you're taking an average household size of about 2.3 persons per household, you're talking north of 50,000 people living in pretty difficult circumstances in the rental sector. When I look at the individual characteristics and how they relate to precarity, we're seeing some very, very clear relationships. In terms of household type, there's a very strong statistical relationship. My p-value here is 0.000, meaning that the chances of this relationship just being an artifact of the data or just by random chance is the odds of that are about 1 in 1,000. So we can be pretty confident in the strength of these relationships, particularly because the data is a representative snapshot of renters in that year. So we see 24% of lone parents are experiencing high levels of precarity, which is double, their sample share, what we would expect of 12%. And this also relates then to the number of children as well. 27% of households with 3 or more kids are experiencing high levels of precarity, again, double their sample share of 13%. So I think it shows that it's those households on a single income, possibly even a fixed income if they're reliant on social welfare entitlements, but also who have very large outgoings in terms of the cost of providing for kids, for school, food, clothing, heat, that they are in a very, very difficult situation. And I would argue, obviously over the course of the COVID pandemic, and again in this kind of cost of living crisis that we've all been going through over particularly the last 10 months, that these challenges are just being amplified. The age of the head of the household doesn't demonstrate a statistically significant relationship other than what we would expect. But I would point out that, 76% of all high precarity cases are in that family formation age group of 25 to 49 years old. So it's these groups that have experienced the impacts of the crash, the credit restrictions that have gone through that decade of austerity in terms of income and employment, that they are very much those experiencing these issues of hardship in the rental sector. In terms of gender, the statistical relationship is just beyond what we would consider significant, but I will point out that females account for 70% of all high precarity cases relative to a sample share of 55%. And I think this relates to the household type issue as well, because I think, there's a greater likelihood that females would be a lone parent. So there is this gender dimension to precarity as well, which I think needs to be explored further. Interestingly, migrants were underrepresented in the precarity data, but this was because migrants were more likely to display characteristics, or rather were less likely to display other characteristics associated with precarity. They were more likely to be in full-time employment, they were likely to be on higher incomes, and they were more likely to be in married couple relationships. In location, again, there's nothing different here other than what we would expect. 85% of all high precarity cases were found in the urban centres, major urban areas. But really strong relationships were demonstrated regarding socioeconomic factors. So households experiencing unemployment, low incomes of below €25,000, and for whom primary education was the highest level of education achieved, were all statistically related to higher precarity cases. Conversely, those that demonstrated no precarity were significantly overrepresented among households in work, among those on incomes over €75,000 and who had third level education. So again, it is those households that have been most impacted by the impacts of the financial crash coming out of it and austerity that again are most vulnerable in this period, I suppose, of recovery. The bivariate relationships tell you quite a bit about associations between precarity and these characteristics, but it doesn't tell you, if you run all of these indicators together, what might emerge, what emerges as the strongest predictors. So as an additional kind of a level of analysis, I ran a series of regression models where I iteratively add all of these variables together to run them in a model to see what emerges as the strongest factors. So I begin with model A, which is just demographic predictors, gender, marital status, age, and what have you. And that gives an R-squared value of 0.097, which basically tells me that these variables together explain about 10% of this underlying phenomenon of housing precarity. There, the only factor that really emerged as a significant predictor was the marital status. And so if you think about that scale range from 0 to 1, every 0.1 movement up that scale, a household who is widowed will move up that scale by 0.235, while a divorced household will move up by 0.103. And again, I think this is tying into that idea of households living on a single income, or perhaps a fixed income in the case of a widowed household who may be on a pension income. The property predictors, location and type, they made very little significant addition to the explanatory power of the model. But there was a huge jump when I added the socioeconomic predictors. R-squared goes up to 0.25. And again, households that were unemployed or had an other employment status, so they might be retired, or they might be a student or working in the home, they were much more likely, the odds were much more likely that they would be experiencing higher precarity levels. And again, low income, those on incomes below 25,000 and low to middle incomes of between 25 and 50,000, all that demonstrated higher scores, as well as those with primary education as their highest level of educational achievement. But this still means that there's a large share of the variance within them, underlying this issue that needs to be explained. So to try and improve that further, I added 2 further measures of financial capability, which was the household's ability to save income regularly and their overall position in terms of overall debt. So if they had credit cards or personal loans or hire purchase loans, and that increased the explanatory model of the power of the model up to 0.39. And all of the other predictors either lost their significance or decreased their significance when I added in these variables. And actually, it was the inability to save income regularly and the household experiencing a heavy debt burden emerged as the strongest predictors, as well as households on lower incomes and unemployment. So really, in terms of prediction, and what we're doing here is adding a precision about how we can measure this. That's the real added value of this paper. It is the inadequacy of income, inadequacy of employment, and over-indebtedness are those key predictors. So just in terms of conclusion, the paper has really tried to explore the extent and the nature of precarity experienced by this new generation of renters. And what I find is that precarity is highly specific to certain subgroups: lone parents, larger families, and those on low to middle incomes, who are precisely the groups that are entering the private rental sector in ever greater numbers, as the CSO information will point out. I think the value of the HPI, the index approach, is that it can actually be used to identify those at risk for future economic shocks, and potentially could help to inform policy responses, maybe more targeted policy responses to addressing the needs of those groups. The index has a broad back, so it can be used to capture further aspects of precarity or other indicators of precarity, and it could be applied at other national scales. It could be applied to other housing tenures as well. In terms of contribution to literature, it adds to Richard Ronald and Justin Cadey's call for more comparative research on rental sector transformations. Much of this work has been based on the UK to date, so I'm adding the Irish context and story to that. But I'm also addressing Amy Clare's call for further research onto the overlaps and the interactions between these different elements and characteristics of precarity. But I do recognize that there needs to be further, work, subjective work on that experience of precarity and the psychological determinants of precarity as well, and how people manage. And to that end, I have also developed some other papers based on qualitative work with renters experiencing precarity during the pandemic, and how those renters are developing coping strategies to manage those issues. And those links to those papers are up there. They are freely available to look at. They're not behind a paywall, and happy to take any further questions people might have in the Q&A after. So thanks very much.
Great. Richard, thank you very much. We're just going to go straight on now to Anne's presentation, and then we'll come back to questions. So again, just to remind listeners, if you have questions, do drop them into the Q&A box. So just to introduce Anne Murphy, Anne joined the agency. She joined the Housing Agency as a research analyst in September 2020, and she's worked on a range of research projects. Her main focus is on the Housing Agency's Attitudes and Aspirations National Studies series. Before joining the Housing Agency, she managed a medical library, was an information specialist on systematic review teams, and served for over a decade on a health research ethics committee. So I'm going to pass over to Anne. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rosalind. And for the invite to the summer series webinar. So I'm Anne Murphy, and as Rosalind has said, I'm a research analyst in the agency since 2020. And this is a great opportunity for me to highlight the agency's Housing Experiences, Attitudes and Aspirations research series before putting a focus on findings about renters from our 2020 survey. So I'll first describe the agency's national study of Irish housing experiences, attitudes and aspirations research series. So back in 2016, the agency didn't have a data set that could inform it about what people thought about their housing or what their aspirations for their future housing were. The agency had and has in its current strategic plan the objective of using housing research to support being a knowledge centre for housing policy and practice. So with that in mind, Rosalind, who was in research at the time and whose vision and work established the national series, was set the task of scoping out a study. She looked outside at what other data existed from other sources and whether this type of information was collected by other organisations in Ireland. She also looked at how other countries collect the information, most notably in the Netherlands and the UK. So part of the scoping identified the concept of residential satisfaction as a key construct for the study. So how happy you are with your home is a complex topic, and it's not just determined by our home, but also our neighbourhoods, which combine to determine our residential satisfaction. The concept also includes and is impacted by how affordable our homes are and whether we own or rent our homes. So all of these aspects impact on our satisfaction, and it was central to how the study was set up. So the overall aim of the research series is to conduct a national study that collects and analyzes information on people's attitudes to their housing, their neighbourhoods, and to learn about their future housing aspirations. The objectives are to collect data that inputs to policy on trends in both over time. It's to collect information on affordability and people's housing journeys. So how did they get to where they are, and how easy or difficult has that journey been for them? It was planned from the start as well to produce reports and papers and to make the data sets that were generated available to researchers. The series first began in 2018 and has been conducted also in 2019 and 2020. So to turn to the 2020 study, the study design for the series is a social research, mixed methods, cross-sectional design, surveying nationally representative samples of householders at regular intervals. 2020 was the third iteration in the series. It had 8 modules and with more than 60 measures in the questionnaire. So again, it was a point-in-time survey of householders in Ireland. It was nationally representative, a sample of 1,500, matched to Census 2016 by gender, social class, and region. In the 2020, we had 526 renters and 859 owners. And for the eagle-eyed, that doesn't add up to 1,500. So we also had 115 householders who lived rent-free in their homes. And in the analysis that follows, I have not included them in that. So 2020, as you might remember, was the pandemic times. And so it changed the research design. And there were 4 major changes that we had to do. We went from a face-to-face interview to an online survey. We changed the time of year, not through choice, but just circumstance. And instead of it being spring, the fieldwork was conducted in December 2020, just as level 3 restrictions were being put in place. We increased the sample size to allow for more representativeness from 1,500 to 1,500 from 1,200. And lastly, we didn't use a 2-stage probability sample. We relied on panels instead. Again, very much driven by the circumstance of the pandemic. So I'm going to turn now to focus on renters, and these are the topics that I'll be covering in the next handful of slides. And I think you'll see that some of them are very related to what Richard has been talking about in his paper preceding my talk here. So I'd just like to note, though, that renters now for this, in the following analyses, the definition of social housing here includes local authority and AHB tenants, but it also includes any renters supported by the HAP, RAS, or the rent supplement. So now, the first chart here presents, I've got 2 charts here showing average scores for the two major satisfaction measures by tenure, one for housing satisfaction and one for neighbourhoods, and comparing renters with owners. So respondents were asked overall, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with your current home? On a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is very dissatisfied and 5 is very satisfied. And likewise, the neighbourhood satisfaction question was the same, except for neighbourhood, and with the same scoring. So measures here that you can see on the charts are out of 5. If you look at the left-hand chart, you can see that renters have a lower average score than owners do. And if you look at the right for their homes, and if you look at the right hand, you can see that renters also have a lower score than owners for their satisfaction with their neighborhood. So overall, renters have lower satisfaction levels than owners do, but actually both groups have higher neighborhood satisfaction than they do for their housing satisfaction. So if I move on to consider incidents of issues with the home, this slide shows the responses. Respondents were asked to rank their current home on 13 different aspects, and you can see them listed on the bottom of the chart there. And to indicate for each aspect the degree to which it was a problem in their home, with being not a problem at all at 1, somewhat of a problem, or 3 would indicate a big problem. And to indicate if an aspect did not apply to their home. For a lot of people working from home when necessary would not have applied, and they wouldn't have had to answer that. So renters are in blue and owners are in yellow, and this chart is ordered left to right in an order of importance to renters. And what's striking here is that renters report higher levels than owners of problems with their home for all of the 13 aspects surveyed. And just to draw your attention, the red circle around 64% for shortage of space for renters. 64% of renters reported shortage of space as a problem compared to only 30% of owners. And you'll see that housing quality, the other 3 circles there, difficulties keeping the home warm, difficulties with or damp and leaks in walls or roof, and rot in windows and doors and roofs. They are the 2nd, 3rd, and 6th out of 13 possible aspects. So issues around housing quality are a high problem, a big problem for renters. Moving away from problems with the dwelling, there are 2 slides now on affordability. This one is concerned with difficulty in meeting rent or mortgage costs, and it shows 2 charts side by side with renters on the left in blue and owners on the right in yellow. Renters were asked to rate the level of difficulty they had in meeting their monthly rental costs on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being a lot of difficulty and 5 having no difficulty. And owners were, with mortgages, on the other hand, were asked to indicate difficulty in meeting their monthly mortgage repayments with a slightly different set of options, from a lot of difficulty, some difficulty, no difficulty, and they were also allowed to choose that they'd prefer not to say. So the results of this then, 34% of renters have difficulty meeting their rent, if we add the 10 and the 24% on the blue on the left. But actually 36% of owners, which is a very similar proportion, indicate difficulty meeting their mortgage payments. But I'd like to draw your attention to only 21% of renters say they have no difficulty paying their rent, whereas 58% of owners say they've no difficulty paying their mortgage. This contrast comes with the caveat, though, that the response options differed in the questions for renters and owners. And so we actually don't know if owners would have indicated average or not much difficulty in meeting mortgage payments. But what we can conclude is that renters struggle with their rent payments in higher proportions than owners do with their mortgage payments. This is the 2nd slide now on affordability, this time looking at perceptions of overall housing costs and the burden these impose on actually 4 tenure groups here. So this is a more detailed breakdown by the tenure subcategories. Householders were asked, when you think of your household's total housing costs, including payments on mortgage or rent, insurance and service charges, and so on, would you say they're a heavy burden, somewhat a burden, no burden at all, or you don't know? And just to mention, you probably spotted that the 2 blue categories are the 2 categories of renters, private and social, and the yellow categories are owners with a mortgage and outright owners. So 38% of owners who own their homes outright report their housing costs are no burden at all. And this is in marked contrast to the other 3 groups. There's little difference in the percentages in the 2 renter groups and the owners with mortgages group reporting housing costs are a burden. It's 83% of private renters, 81% of social renters, and 82% of owners with a mortgage reporting that housing costs are a burden for them. A much cleaner chart here, I've returned to a chart showing a comparison between 2 groups and showing average scores, this time for private renters and social renters. And the score is for security of tenure. Renters were asked, renters only were asked this question, and how secure they believe their tenure to be on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being very insecure and 5 being very secure. So private renters have a score of 3.27, while social renters score 3.59, a difference that reaches statistical significance, showing that private renters experience lower levels of tenure security than social renters. And then we turn to private and renters' expectations about their future type of tenure. They were asked, in the future, are you always likely to, 1, buy at some point in the future, or 2, always rent, or don't know? And private renters here are in the dotted blue, and social renters are in the stripy blue and white. 59% of private renters reported they were likely to buy in the future, compared with 38% of social renters. But I think it's notable that 22% of private renters thought they would always rent. Although whether this is because they want to rent as a positive choice, or they thought they would have to rent, it's not possible to conclude. So now, coming to housing aspirations, this slide shows 2 charts, again, side by side. That might not be totally clear, with renters and owners in the left-hand chart and private and social renters looked at in more detail in the right-hand chart. And each chart again shows average scores for intention to move. So we asked householders to rate how likely they were to move to another home in the future on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 was very unlikely and 5 is very likely. So higher scores show a greater intention to move in the future. So the chart on the left shows that renters have a higher average score, 3.42, compared to owners with an average of 2.26, indicating that renters are more likely to move than owners, and this difference is statistically significant. If we turn our attention to the chart on the right then, where we look in greater detail at the 2 renter groups, we see that private renters have a higher average score of 3.91 compared with social renters at 2.82 for intention to move, which is also statistically significant, indicating that private renters are more likely to move than social renters. And for me, it's also interesting that owners and social renters, their average scores are both below 3 at 2.26 for owners and 2.82 for social renters. And staying with housing aspirations, if we dig down into why householders are likely to move, we do find that renters and owners differ in the most important reasons to them. So we asked householders what were the reasons they would move. There were 13 response options, and respondents could select as many as applied. So, and again, you can see that renters are in blue and our owners are in yellow. And this is in order of importance to renters from the top down on the chart. The top 2 renters are there with the red circles. For renters are that they would want to buy a home or they want more space for a growing family. But I'd also like to say to you that more space for a growing family is also important for owners, and for both renters and owners. It's actually it's a bit hard to see on the chart, but it's the second most important reason for both of the groups. So that family formation part really does play into our aspirations for our homes. And that's the end of the findings, or the slides that lead to these findings. So as I'm coming to the close of the talk, what can we conclude about some of the housing experiences and attitudes of renters from our 2020 survey? Well, renters are less satisfied with their housing and neighbourhoods than owners. And renters report higher levels of problems with their dwelling than owners, particularly with housing quality and shortage of space. 34% of renters experience difficulty meeting their housing payments, but housing costs pose a similar level of burden for all but outright owners. Private renters experience lower levels of tenure security than social renters, and private renters, though 60% of them would like to intend to buy a home in the future. And then renters are more likely to intend to move than owners, while private renters are more likely to intend to move than social renters. And finally, the top 2 reasons for renters intending to move would be to buy a home or to have space for a growing family. So to wrap up now, I'd like to draw your attention, as Rosalind has previously, to our reports, which are available from the agency website, and also that the 2018 and 2019 data sets are available through the ISDA archive up in UCD, and the links for both are on the slide there. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand back to Rosalind.
Great. Thanks very much, Anne. Thank you, Richard. I think we can have both Richard and Anne spotlighted now. So we have time for questions. If people want to pop questions into the Q&A box, I'd ask you to do that. But in the meantime, a couple of questions. Firstly, I suppose, I think just to say both presentations kind of speak to each other. Richard, I'm sure you both kind of, when you were preparing and listening to each other's presentations, you probably saw some of the overlap between the interesting findings from both of them. I suppose just, Richard, your presentation very much kind of shows the nature and the demographic profile of the rental sector really changing dramatically in a kind of over a short period of time. I was kind of very taken with the fact that 30 to 44-year-olds now are the largest kind of age group of renting sector, kind of renters. And I suppose my question is, you know, how do you see, I suppose, that change, that shift impacting kind of on policy and on, I suppose, society, as it's a big question, but it is a kind of something that I think we need to be aware of. And having worked in the area of housing for older people, I've kind of been aware of it, but I hadn't realized quite how dramatic that shift in renting had been.
Yeah, it's a huge issue, and it was one that I have to say, when I analyzed the data, I was kind of surprised at myself, just the extent of the growth. I think it throws up very important, you know, socioeconomic questions going into the future. I'm trying to recall, there was a report perhaps a year or so ago, and I think, if I'm right, it suggested that, I could be wrong on the figures here, but I think it suggested that 90,000 renters were aged 55 and over. I may be getting the year wrong, maybe it's 50, but I mean, that's a huge number of people that, you know, are going to be paying private rental, you know, private rents and in the private rental sector as they age into retirement, and paying high rents on fixed pension income is a very, very significant issue. And it's one, I think, that as policymakers and practitioners in the area of housing, that it's one we need to be acutely aware of. I'm not entirely sure what an answer might be, but certainly I think looking more at the experiences of older renters and possibly even, as Anne has done there, looking at their expectations and aspirations for their future welfare within housing, I think would be a very important area to investigate further.
So maybe the next question then, Richard, for you would be, do you think this housing precarity index, so it's you know, you looked at kind of the most recent census data, 2016, so it'll be interesting to update it now with the 2022 data when that's available next year. But I suppose, is this index something that can be used and applied to other housing tenures?
Yes.
Or yeah.
Absolutely. And this is the strength of it, that it can be used. The way I have devised the index, and it differs slightly from that that Amy Clare had devised, is that you can actually, with the indicators I've selected, you can measure across years, which is something that they were not able to do in their paper. They could only look at the data from 2012 just because of the nature of the questions that were asked in that year. So there's absolutely no reason why, you know, let's say scaling up this project, it couldn't be done over a longer time period. It can be looked at across different tenures in greater depth. But interestingly, it can also be done in a cross-nationally comparative way as well, because you could actually start to look at housing precarity in other housing systems, even other housing welfare systems. You know, if the Irish model is a traditional kind of liberal model, you could look at social democratic models from Northern Europe, corporatist models from Central Europe, and do some really interesting comparative work in that space, and that's really where I'd like to take it to. But in short, yes, it can absolutely be used as a monitoring tool, definitely.
Okay, great. And just in terms of a couple of the questions, firstly, there's a question here that's come in from Aoife McGillicuddy. Do you think the numbers moving from the private rented to the social housing will increase in the next few years as the number of private rented properties decrease? It's probably not from your data set that you'll be able to see that, but is there capacity for that to happen in terms of housing stock in the social housing sector?
Well, I probably can't speak to that point. I don't think our data is it's cross-sectional in nature, but I would say there's probably a debate around the definitions of renters. I have two definitions out of the data there that I've used of private and social, but I know that there's an argument now developing around HAP, if you're in receipt of HAP or rent supplement or RAS, does that make you another kind of tenure? Should we be paying attention to that? So I think that's where I would be maybe focusing. I would be focusing my analysis really on, intend to focus analysis on looking at renter categories from our data and seeing are there differences, and developing a research question around that. And for the future, maybe it will be possible to compare from different years, but at the moment I would say I couldn't throw any light on that.
No. Yeah, okay, so the next question maybe to both of you really is, it's back to, would there be a way of tying lack of pensions to age demographics to predict how renting will affect aging renters? So I suppose this is back to Housing Precarity Index, perhaps, Richard. I think you showed maybe that, is it that younger people who were with larger families, lone parents, and potentially younger and unemployed were probably more at risk? Is that right? I suppose, is there a way of looking at the age demographics for those who are renting who are older? But you didn't see any sign of that at the moment in your data set.
It didn't emerge in the data set, and like I said, the largest cohort was certainly the 25 to 49 cohort. And there was nothing, they accounted for, I think it was 76% of cases, and there was nothing, that was expected. That was relative to their sample shares as well. But I think separating out the older data themselves, in themselves, and looking at them almost as a separate cohort, or running the analysis just on older renters alone, I think could reveal some interesting findings. And I would need to double check with the SILC data, but I'm pretty sure that the SILC data records levels of pension income within it. So you could probably look at those that are looking at differences between those that are on lower pension provision and relative to those that are in a higher or more comfortable position, and looking at it that way. But yeah, I think that is absolutely something that could be done, and could be done across tenures as well.
Yeah. Okay. Then a question for both of you, I suppose. Anne, you mentioned that the research study was done December 2020, height of lockdown. And potentially, I suppose, has COVID had an impact? Do you, I suppose, looking at your data set and some of the results and some of the findings, do you think COVID impacted some of what you've been seeing coming through in the data in 2020? And then, yeah, Richard, I suppose, just in more generally, how do you think potentially COVID has impacted the experience of precarity with some of the qualitative work you had done? And again, there was qualitative work done for the 2020 Housing Agency survey. So maybe, Anne, if you want to kind of maybe just reflect on kind of potentially.
Yes. Well, I do think that security of tenure measure might have been different had the pandemic not occurred, and it is possible there was a higher, in my opinion, there's probably a higher score for private renters than would have been the case had there not been eviction bans and the like, and the other measures that were taken during the pandemic. I think that's one very specific measure that probably has had an impact or a difference because of COVID. But also we did include questions about COVID in the 2020 round, which I haven't obviously reported today, but and they definitely they need digging into, because there actually seems to be a mosaic effect at first view of the impact of COVID on how people felt about their housing, with some feeling much more positive and other groups feeling more negative, but it wasn't predictable. And what seemed to be driving it wasn't predictable. So actually it's a fascinating set of questions to be asked there, and to really dig out. And how transient was that? That's what we also can't tell just at the moment. And are there longer term trends coming out of that? What's happening with, for me, I'm interested in what's happening with as well, people's perception of their homes as multifunctional spaces, working from home, all of those kinds of issues we could definitely be digging into and finding out more. And then coming back to in the next iteration of the survey to get a picture. Yeah.
Okay, Richard.
Yeah,
It
was really interesting following up on some of these issues and some of the qualitative interviews that I did with renters. And actually, it's really interesting to see Anne's results, because a lot of what renters were exactly the issues that she was highlighting in her kind of sentiment surveys. It was, I mean, specifically around COVID. Yes, there were concerns around ability to pay, income. People, small numbers of my respondents have been impacted in terms of unemployment and income, but it was temporary. And some of them managed to come to negotiations with their landlords, which was some of the more positive findings. But the stuff around quality, space standards just came up again and again and again. People in shared accommodation, shared bedrooms, small studio. There was a lot of frustration towards studio apartments. The ability and the difficulty of working from home while living in shared, houses of multiple occupation. The ability just to store belongings and that kind of thing. Renters would have talked to me about how they were storing, belongings out in cars and this kind of thing, because they just couldn't fit their belongings into their homes, and how that was a real source of it impacted their ability to find comfort in their rental properties as homes. So that kind of ontological security around the home was certainly impacted during the pandemic. Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so maybe I think, one of the things, having looked at some of the qualitative research from the 2020 study as well, another point was just being safe in your home, again, in that for renters who are in mixed homes, and that came through very strongly as well. But then on a positive note, I think was around neighborhoods. Would that be right, Anne? Some renters really actually got to know their neighbors.
There was
for the first time.
Yeah, and there was more a feeling of community for them. Came out very strongly from several of the focus groups, and that was very interesting. They felt that they could put down roots a bit more, and because everybody was in lockdown, there was more opportunity to meet their neighbours, whereas normally, especially in apartment blocks, that it's harder. Those common areas, they're corridors rather than congregation spaces. So I'd love to know what's happened there.
Okay, well, maybe this brings me on to, I'm kind of conscious of the time, but I'd love to ask both of you before we finish kind of what's next. So what's next with the housing precarity, the Rental Precarity Index, Richard, and what's next with the research series? And so maybe if I go to Richard first.
Well, as I said, my kind of plan at the minute is to try and scale this up into a larger project. I'm actually looking at European funding through the European Commission. They have recently just posted a Horizon Europe call regarding housing inequalities that I think this Precarity Index and a wider project around precarity could really funnel into. And like I said, trying to do those kind of cross-national comparisons across housing welfare regimes. That's where my head is at the minute, if you like.
Okay, great. And Anne?
That sounds very exciting, Richard. So we're currently working on the next version, the next iteration of the survey, aiming for spring 2023. And we'd really welcome people's feedback on what's worked well so far. And are there additional areas you'd like us to cover? So, you know, and we would design in comparability with our 2018, it's a 5-year difference. It's very census, you know, a 5-year comparison, that idea is there. We would return to face-to-face interviewing, and we'd return to a spring, a same time of the year. So the other part is that I intend to start producing charts and put them on the Housing Agency's Data Hub. I want to give a shout out to the agency's Data Hub, full of really great stats. And yeah, just lots more analysis then on the existing data sets too.
Okay, brilliant. I'm looking forward to that, Anne. Okay, so I'd just like to thank everybody for listening, for your questions. I'd like to thank Richard and Anne for their really interesting presentations today. As I said earlier, there's a lot of information up on our Housing Agency website. So Richard's papers, reports for the Housing Agency for the Research Support Programme are there and available there. And previous reports from which you can see a couple of them on the mantelpiece placed here, from our research series on the attitudes and experience of Irish householders are also available in the publications section. So just to finish by saying, we hope that as many of you as possible will tune in to our next session of the Research Summer Series. It's going to be held on the 28th of July, and it's going to look at some of the research work that's been done specifically, I suppose, in the area of local authorities. So both of the pieces of research were funded through the Research Support Programme. So the first is going to be a presentation on tenant engagement from Dr. Pádraig Kenna of NUI Galway. And there'll also be a session on void management by Campbell Tickell. And then we'll have a third and final session in the summer series in September, and more details will follow. I think that's the 15th of September we have earmarked for the date. So just before we finish, going back to the area of the rental sector, oh yes, next week the Housing Agency is hosting with Clúid Housing a seminar on cost rental as part of the International Social Housing Festival, with speakers from the Housing Agency, Department of Housing, Clúid Housing, Housing Europe, and representatives from Austria, Denmark, and Finland speaking about cost rental in their countries. So that is going to be on Thursday at 11 a.m. So it's a 2.5-hour seminar. It's a hybrid event, and you can find how to register for that again on our website. So, you know, please do register if you're interested in that whole area. It should be a very interesting discussion. I'm going to just finish by thanking everyone for listening, and see you soon, hopefully next week. And
Cheers.
All right, the cost rental.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Anne.
Take care. All the best.
Bye. Bye.